Right, let's talk about the game between Manchester United and Liverpool. I'm delighted to say Samuel Luckhurst is with us to help preview the game and maybe talk a little bit about what's going on in the background to it. Samuel, good morning to you. How are you?
Good morning. Very well, thank you. Thank you for having me on again.
We were just chatting in the ad break about how repetitive this story is and how difficult it is to find something new to say about how badly run Manchester United are at the moment. And yet, maybe there's a little bit of green shoots with the signing of Casemiro. What's your instinct about the direction that we're heading in at the moment?
It really is difficult to keep up at times. In that, when the Casemiro reports emerged last week, immediately you thought that's not a goer. That feels fanciful. 5 times Champions League winner, joining Europa League fodder, a team who've just had their worst season in decades, and yet 3 days later, United announced that they've signed him. It's pretty clear what the main source of motivation is for Casemiro, but because United are desperate, because they are panic buying now, they're in a situation where anything goes, they'll accept anything. In the case of Casemiro, he's got great pedigree. He was brilliant in the Champions League final in May against Liverpool. You look at those Champions League final triumphs, he's done it twice against Jurgen Klopp's teams. So there are a lot of positives from it. I don't think it's necessarily a massive coup. I mean, ultimately, United have overspent a hell of a lot on someone who, although not aging, is their peak years are probably behind them. And although he's got the World Cup coming up, so he needs to maintain rhythm there, he's on an obscenely long contract for a 30-year-old. And this is another common theme with Manchester United, in that they can't help but dole out contracts that are far too long to players, whatever the age, whatever the pedigree. And previously, that was cited as a flaw of the past regime. That was on Ed Woodward's watch. That wouldn't be happening again, but it is already happening. It's still too early to judge these players who are getting new contracts, these new signings. Lisandro Martinez is already on a 6-year contract, effectively, and you've got pundits like Jamie Carragher saying that he can't do it in a back four in the Premier League. So it'll be interesting to see how that develops. But as far as the management and the players are concerned, as dreadful as it has been at the start of the season, some of them are going to need time, and understandably the focus has been on the ownership over the last few weeks or so.
That focus on the ownership, we've actually seen that before, but it never really leads to anything. Is there any sense that it's different this time, or is it chatter that people are trying to manifest into reality as opposed to something real?
It's a good question. The fact that Sir Jim Ratcliffe his spokesman has come out and clarified that he is interested in buying Manchester United, which a lot of people have suspected for quite some time. Ratcliffe did an interview with the BBC earlier in the year where he practically said he would be, but that United weren't for sale. And it's still unclear if they are indeed for sale. I mean, the Glazer family are never going to comment on this. They're hermits, really. They're extremely reticent and extremely coy about their plans. There's not a lot of transparent communication. Joel Glazer has spoken to a handful of Manchester United fans on the a fans advisory board, but I believe those fans who go on it have to sign a non-disclosure act. So nothing or very little comes out of those meetings, which again I don't think is particularly progressive for fan club relations, when the co-chairman and the main owner and the man who's mainly involved with the running of Manchester United on a day-to-day basis. I mean, believe it or not, Joel Glazer does hold daily calls with people in Manchester about what's going on over here and what's the latest crisis. But it's not in the United fans' interest for these discussions to be held in such a discreet manner. But that's part of the agreement that the club and these handful of fans settled on after the Super League last year. And I just think that although there has been a lot of noise over the last week, thanks to Elon Musk, firstly, and then, as I said, Sir Jim Ratcliffe did declare his interest. We have seen this before, maybe not to this extent, but the Glazers are very stubborn. They can be very obdurate, and there is safe distance between them and Manchester United supporters, which is the Atlantic Ocean. Joel Glazer has not been to a United game in nearly 3.5 years. It was a jolt to see Avram Glazer and Edward Glazer at the Brighton home game 2 weeks ago. They pick up their semi-annual dividend as dreadful as Manchester United have been, and as as a brand, they are not. They're not as great as they used to be, but they are still a very lucrative cash cow for the Glazer siblings, and they have no problem taking their semi-annual dividend.
You mentioned the point earlier that the long contracts were supposed to be the hallmark of the Woodward era, and yet here we are, and the same thing has continued. Who's making that decision now? Is that Richard Arnold, who was actually supposed to, it looked like, separate the football and the business, or is it John Murtagh who's saying, yeah, actually the right thing to do here is to give Casemiro 5 years and to give anybody who's coming in a longer term contract than is generally the norm at the moment in the football world?
Arnold would always have to request sign-off from Tampa and the family, and mainly Joel Glazer, on a signing or a new contract. And you look at the picture last week, United had one of their worst defeats in maybe 50 years at Brentford, getting in a Real Madrid midfielder who nobody really expected to leave Real Madrid this summer, who only signed a new contract at Real Madrid last year. Signing him on a £70 million deal, which it could eventually rise to, is good PR. It's a midfield signing. United, amazingly, had gone 4 years without signing an out-and-out central midfielder. So at the end of the day, it's clear who had who over a barrel there. I mean, Casemiro is getting potentially a 5-year contract if that +1 is extended. There's not another elite club in Europe that would have paid 60 million, rising to 10 million, for a midfielder who had fallen down the pecking order at Real Madrid. And there's no way another elite club in Europe would have made that player one of their highest earners. That's the desperate position Manchester United are in. The positive for United is that they are signing a defensive midfielder, and they are signing one of the best defensive midfielders. Whether he can maintain that level in the Premier League in a midfield that really is non-existent, that doesn't have any half the passing quality of the midfielders he was accustomed to playing with at Real Madrid. He had two of the greatest passers in probably the game's history, in Toni Kroos and Luka Modric either side of him. At United, he could have Scott McTominay and Fred either side of him on a weekly basis. In the case of Fred, he at least is familiar with him. They do play regularly together for Brazil. They are their starting midfielders. They actually keep Fabinho out of the side. But speaking to an agency contact last week, they flagged that Casemiro's running stats are not particularly great, which, again, it's not a great surprise. La Liga is quite a sedate pace. Real Madrid are bound to control most of the games that they play in. I was told that his running stats are worse than Scott McTominay's, but that's to be expecting, that the Premier League is a much more frenetic pace. And also McTominay can be so careless with the ball, he ends up having to chase shadows.
Samuel, just to clarify, the mood on the ground in terms of the game tonight, I mean, what are we expecting in terms of the atmosphere and the sort of the talk of protest or unrest, or what is the sense of what's going to happen here tonight?
It's difficult to predict. It's going to be quite virulent outside the ground. Ultimately, this is a sold-out game, so despite pleas on social media to empty Old Trafford and for it to look quite sparse, I think that would be a surprise, in that it's one of the biggest games in world football. The demand to be at this game is still extremely high. I think because of the fixture and what happened with the Super League protest in May of last year, some parallels have been drawn with that. But in that case, when United fans were clear, a militant faction was certainly hell-bent on getting that game postponed. It was easier to do that then, because it was a game that was played behind closed doors. Tens of thousands will be driving or travelling to Old Trafford tonight with every intention of clicking through the turnstiles. A lot of the protesters outside will be ticketless, which isn't a problem whatsoever. Some supporters are just disenchanted with following United. They don't want to pay the Glazer family. That's perfectly principled, and I think a lot of the fans who are outside the Norwich game in April during those quite captivating protests were ticketless, and it's bound to appeal to them. But as far as tonight goes, I don't think the Casemiro signing is necessarily going to dilute the protests from those who've organised this. But unfortunately, these protests, since they started by a particular group in April, they have been quite ineffectual. And when the attempt to walk out on a certain minute, I think during the Brentford game or the Chelsea game towards the end of the season, you had the banner up, and the minute was still listed on the scoreboard that they were still actually inside the stadium. So I don't think they're ever really going to unsettle the Glazers. When the green and gold protest starts in 2010, which did have genuine momentum and really did become a movement for the 4 or 5 months that it was sustained by the supporters, the Glazers actually became more present and attended more games at Old Trafford because they felt as though they wanted to front up and show that they could take on these supporters and that they wouldn't be cowed by them. That's not going to happen now. But as I said, Edward Glazer and Avram Glazer were at the Brighton game the other week, and they had little or no problem getting into the stadium. Whereas when the first time the three siblings visited Old Trafford after the takeover, I think it was Joel, Avram and Brian, they needed a police escort to get out because there was an angry mob outside.
Things have definitely changed on that front. To talk about the football for a change, which I know is kind of remarkable that there's going to be a match that happens. What do you expect from Manchester United tonight, and what do you expect from Erik ten Hag tonight?
Well, the players want a more pragmatic approach, which is almost an admission of defeat that they don't have the skill set to execute his instructions or his game plan, which is why United need more signings beyond Casemiro, which is why Ten Hag has been targeting players he's familiar with. I mean, Casemiro, United tried to say he was high on their list of midfield targets, but I mean, sometimes you think, do they think we were born yesterday? That they were holding out for Frankie de Jong all summer because the manager really wanted him. And in the end, they've just had to walk away because they didn't make any headway there in the last 6 weeks because of the wage deferral issue that de Jong has got at Barcelona. And really, from the outset, that was a deal that was fraught with problems because de Jong never really wanted to join Manchester United. So they've had to rejig their plans. And although Ten Hag insists that the plans haven't changed at all, de Jong and Casemiro are markedly different players, and the way that midfield was exposed by Brighton, then even more so against Brentford, a defensive midfielder was always going to be non-negotiable. But it's not a coincidence that United have moved with uncharacteristic alacrity to get Casemiro in. Unfortunately, he's not going to be available tonight. He's still not been fully signed up. So it's going to be fascinating to see what Ten Hag does with the midfield, because he does not have the personnel there to stymie Liverpool. Liverpool have got some injury issues. They've not looked quite themselves in their first 2 games. Van Dijk has looked particularly vulnerable, which is unlike him. So there's some hope for United in that sense. But as far as the Liverpool midfield goes, and Thiago not being available, the 3 midfielders who lined up in the 5-0 thrashing of United last season are available, and they are still a far better team than United. It's a game that loomed rather ominously at the start of the season for United fans. After Brighton and Brentford, it's looked like a terrifying prospect. But the fact that Liverpool haven't looked quite themselves, and it can't get any worse, you would think, from United's perspective, after that Brentford game, that does offer United fans some hope. But again, I can't settle on a team where I think that United could absolutely certainly take on Liverpool toe-to-toe or give them a good game. It's a big test of what Ten Hag does and whether he does actually compromise his own ethos and principles and rein in what he wants to do, because United are coming up against a team that have had their number in recent seasons.
Like, what is compromising his principles in this game? Like, what is an approach that would represent that?
Well, he tried to suggest that playing out from the back was naive at Brentford, which it certainly was, and that he wanted United to draw them in and then go long. And I think Ten Hag, he told us in pre-season, I mean, there's more than one way to skin a cat, effectively, in that he's not just hell-bent on playing beautiful total football or playing the Cruyff way or the Ajax way. I think he's more than aware that in the Premier League you're going to come up against various opponents, and you will have to adapt your style from time to time. And he showed at Ajax that he's not got one fixed formation. His first good team there, they played in the 4-2-3-1. His last good team that won the league title last season, it was more of a 4-3-3, and they had the focal point with Sebastian Haller up front, which is why it's always been a bit perplexing that people suggest that Cristiano Ronaldo can't play in a Ten Hag team when Sebastian Haller did that Ajax last season. But with this game tonight, he can't play McTominay and Fred because that was exposed last season, and it was exposed in the very first game of this season. There are players in the attack. Bruno Fernandes has got a hell of a lot worse since he, unsurprisingly, got a new contract in April, a contract that only added 1 year onto its expiry date, but he got a big pay rise. Wayne Rooney said in his Sunday Times column that he wouldn't start Marcus Rashford. There'll be a hell of a lot of United fans that agree with that because Rashford has just looked out of sorts for 18 months, it must be said now, at club level. But the alternatives, the strength and depth, it's just not there. So Ten Hag is limited as to what he can do. If Ole Gunnar Solskjaer was in this position, he would probably go to a back three. And yesteryear, he'd have ground out a pretty commendable draw, which was the case, I think, in the October 2019 game when he was under the cosh. When that knack of getting big performances when he was on the rocks deserted him last season, that's when it spiralled and he ended up getting the sack by United. Whether Ten Hag actually follows the Solskjaer blueprint will be interesting, because if he does, I'm sure there'll be some grumbles from supporters that will start to feel, well, is this guy any different or different enough to what Ole Gunnar Solskjaer does? Because Solskjaer said himself last season he did not want to play with a back three. He didn't want to have this almost defeatist air about United going into games, but felt that he had to because they were coming up against such better sides in his final games. Liverpool and City were two of the teams he came up against in his last 4 or 5 weeks. It's still, Ten Hag is nowhere near that territory yet, but the circumstances are somewhat similar going into this Liverpool game because United are coming off the back of such a dreadful defeat to Brentford. So whether he's more pragmatic or not remains to be seen, but that's something that the players would favour. He
could easily pick 3 at the back, right? That might get him out of some of the short-term issues around Maguire and Martinez's height, and give him a little bit of betting in opportunity. And would a 0-0 draw tonight not be something that Man United fans are like, well, we've steadied the ship?
Well, I think they would snap your hand off at a 0-0 draw, just because it would halt the negativity that has started since the first weekend of the season. I can't quite remember the last time Ten Hag would have played with a back three, but certainly when Martinez came in, it was a question to ask, just because it was a huge investment in a defender. They'd made huge investments in far more esteemed defenders in recent years, in Maguire, who is still a world record for a defender, his transfer fee of 80 million, and Rafael Varane coming in last year. But Ten Hag was quite clear to us in Melbourne during pre-season that he saw Martinez as someone to come in and strengthen the team, and Maguire was a first choice. What's interesting is that Ten Hag is giving serious consideration to dropping Maguire tonight. It's still unclear if he has taken that decision and followed through with it, but it is something that's on his mind, given how poorly Maguire has started the season, and Varane has to come in this evening. If he does go with a back three, I don't think it would be a major surprise. I don't think he wants to crush Martinez's confidence so quickly. Martinez, of course, can play as defensive midfield, which might be a stopgap option for tonight's game, just because United are going to need someone to hold the fort there against one of the best attacks in football. Okay, Liverpool won't have Jota, or who I believe is still injured, and obviously Darwin Núñez is suspended, but the firepower they have is still pretty ominous for United, and they put 9 goals past them last season. So United are going to need that extra security. They can't be as loose as they were against Brighton, never mind Brentford, when you had Christian Eriksen effectively doubling as a defensive midfielder, which was an experiment that not many people could remember from his Tottenham days. And as is often the case with such experiments in football, it didn't work.
No, it definitely famously it didn't at this stage. Some quickfire questions around transfers. Is Marcus Rashford for sale? Is there a possibility he leaves in the next 10 days?
United would say no. I think it's too much of a stretch for him to go in the next 10 days. PSG did meet with his brother, but they already feel as though they're being used as a negotiation tactic by the brother to get Rashford a new contract at Manchester United, which a lot of United fans would probably laugh at the prospect, because like a lot of players, pretty much all the players who are technically out of contract next year but have the +1 option on their deals, United fans would argue that none of them deserve a new contract. And that's the invidious position United are in, because they're either going to have to give him a new contract, they're going to have to sell him, because letting Marcus Rashford go on a free is just something that they can't entertain. I think he would be 26 at that age. I think with Pogba, it was just about, understandable because of the way it had unravelled, but I don't think it would get that course. I don't think the fans would turn as virulently against Marcus Rashford as they did with Paul Pogba.
Is Jadon Sancho going to be an Erik ten Hag player, do you think?
I think he's probably one of the players who's got a better chance of it, but one of the issues I certainly had with him when United signed him was that he was used to an environment where there was no pressure, and he's gone into the most intense pressure cooker environment in football probably. And during pre-season, he was excellent. He was United's best player. But then as soon as the competitive games started, as you've seen, he's regressed. And that might be the issue with Sancho. In that I don't think it's an issue of ability, but being in that pressure cook environment at Manchester United, it rumbles players very, very quickly. And last season, it rumbled almost everyone in that squad. And so far, he's not really shown that he's got the nous to cope with the pressure. But ability-wise, I think he's certainly one of the players who's likelier to thrive under Ten Hag.
Cristiano's cryptic Instagram post about "I'll tell the truth in 14 days," was that like because he'll be somewhere else, or was that because the window will be closed and it'll be too late for anything to happen? Did you have any read on that, and does it have any implications about where he's playing football in a couple of weeks?
Well, an interview's not been promised to me or any of my colleagues, so I'd be fascinated to see who does end up having that discussion with him. But I think that's the most the clearest hint yet from him that he wants to leave. I think it's the closest he's ever going to come to publicly saying that he wants to leave United anyway. But it doesn't really help matters. Gary Neville said it last week. Why has he got to wait 2 weeks? He can give that conversation now. If he wanted to have that discussion now, that would be ending the debate or any sort of rumblings over his future, because I think it'd be confirmation that he is staying. But he's deciding to wait until the transfer window closes, which would again indicate that he's holding out for Jorge Mendes, his agent, to make the impossible possible and get him an agreeable move somewhere.
I was going to say, it's more than likely he'll interview himself on one of his own channels, but actually he could get Jorge Mendes to interview him, and one of those hard-hitting...
someone. Yeah. It's just a perfectly normal Manchester United story, isn't it, to have a player promising a tell-all interview in 2 weeks?
Yeah.
This is
when
normal.
He won't be a United
normal.
player.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
You must feel like you're somehow in an episode of Succession most of the time, Samuel.
Either that, or it's certainly in recent weeks, it's felt like I've started writing for Private Eye, writing about a bid for Marko Arnautovic, and United comparing him to players from yesteryear who they deemed successes, who were actually not successes. I mean, Arnautovic was likened to Laurent Blanc as a pragmatic short-term signing, as if, I mean, for people who can't remember, Laurent Blanc was a world-class player when he was at Inter Milan and Barcelona. He was certainly not at Manchester United. It was one of the worst pieces of business that Sir Alex Ferguson ever did in selling Jaap Stam and bringing him in. So it has felt extremely surreal. And as I said, with the Casemiro deal, that just seemed fanciful. I think, speaking to colleagues, we all thought, well, yeah, come August 31st, Real Madrid will be announcing that Casemiro's got a new contract. But amazingly, United have got this one over the line, which again just highlights the desperation at the club.
If you had to guess, how many more signings will there be in this window, do you think?
I'd say a minimum one, but they would want to. I think they want a backup goalkeeper still, which is not a particularly... that would not be a significant signing, but I still think they will get another forward in, just because they do not have established depth in that squad. And the Ronaldo situation, they need someone who's going to offer them a different attacking outlet. But if it is Anthony, there's no guarantee that he's going to be a reliable source of goals, and that's the problem they've got with the forwards who Ten Hag settled on in pre-season, Martial, Sancho and Rashford. None of them are dependable goal scorers. The only dependable goal scorer in the squad wants out.
Samuel, great stuff. Thanks a million. Enjoy the game tonight. Cheers.
Thank you very much. Nice to be on.
Samuel Luckhurst there giving us his thoughts on the game tonight.